So my name is Jamie Stair. Have the honor of being the president of the International T.S. Eliot Society. So I'll be chairing this memorial lecture session, session 8. Reminders from the tech team, as you know, if you could please check and make sure that your microphone is muted now. Keep your hands inside the ride at all times, and you can place yourself in line to ask a question of Dr. Pinsky after the lecture. Just send me a quick chat message at any time. As an international literary society, we devote ourselves to scholarly and critical studies of T.S. Eliot, following a range of practices and methodologies that include the historical, textual, archival, ideological, and contextual. But while Eliot himself was an admirer of good scholarship and an excellent literary critic and commentator, his heart was in the creation of art. And so, in addition to the prominent scholars and critics who have been our memorial speakers, it is entirely fitting that we often ask a practicing poet to give us their take on how they have used, absorbed, or resisted Eliot's work. We've been honored in the past to have fine poets as our memorial speakers: Grace Schulman, Craig Raine, Geoffrey Hill, Carl Phillips, and James Longenbach among them. Which brings us to Robert Pinsky. Robert Pinsky is everywhere. He is the Where's Waldo of the literary world. The number of talks he has given, poems he has published, and projects he has started is staggering. The awards he has received include the Korean Manhei Award, the Italian Premio Capri, and the Harold Washington Award from the city of Chicago. Perhaps unintentionally, Pinsky has resurrected the erstwhile trope of the romantic superpoet. T.S. Eliot is sometimes thought of as the end of that line, the last poet-critic who could fill a football stadium. But my money would be on Pinsky's ability to quiet and entertain the soccer hooligans for an hour or two. The Poetry Foundation summarizes this consensus, calling Pinsky, quote, the last of the civic or public poets. Dr. Pinsky is the only poet to be named to 3 terms as poet laureate. He used that public post to found the Favorite Poem Project. Of its founding principle, Pinsky explains that, quote, contrary to stereotype, Americans do read poetry, that the audience for poetry is not limited to professors and college students, and that there are many people for whom particular poems have profound personal meaning. I would strongly encourage you, if you haven't done so yet, to visit the Favorite Poem Project and that website and watch some of those very affecting videos there. Given Pinsky's prestige and the encomia heaped upon him, I hesitated when I was drafting this introduction, wondering if he might be annoyed to be compared to Where's Waldo. But then I discovered that he was once a guest on The Simpsons, so the man clearly does not stand on ceremony or take himself too seriously. He fits right in. Pinsky may not take himself too seriously, but he takes his work as a poet and as an arts advocate deadly seriously. Writing in the New York Times, Joel Brower has written of Pinsky's work that it is, quote, not just an argument for, but a demonstration of contemporary poetry's necessity and vitality in our democracy. Brower continues, writing of Pinsky's volume, Gulf Music. The poems here are among the best examples we have of poetry's ability to illuminate not only who we are as humans, but who we are and can be as a nation. This international society of Eliot lovers needs people like Robert Pinsky, and his own nation, America, needs him badly. His lecture today is entitled T.S. Eliot, 1933, 1958, 1962, 2016. Please join me in welcoming Robert Pinsky to our virtual stage.
Thank you so much, Jamie. I'm honored and very pleased to be talking to the T.S. Eliot Society. Uh, and I'm very happy to have an opportunity to continue my lifelong learning from Eliot and devotion to Eliot. As to where's Waldo, Jamie, it is in the tradition of Eliot to be intensely interested in, I could say, popular culture, or I could say in an idea of culture that is not dichotomous as to high and low. Eliot's interest in music hall in his adopted country, and his correspondence and entertaining to dinner Julius Groucho Marx from Eliot's birth country. That idea of culture as including things like, indeed, The Simpsons, is one of the things that in my mind is behind the similarity I have found since I was in college and eager to write poetry, the similarity between Eliot and Allen Ginsberg. I've written elsewhere in prose that I thought that T.S. Eliot and Allen Ginsberg were very similar poets when I was starting out. I was 17 or 18 years old. And then I was taught that they're tremendous opposites. They're not similar at all. And then years after that, I decided that they were indeed very similar. I hope that I have not teased you all as scholars of Eliot. I hope I haven't given you anxiety by making 1933 the first date in my sequence. I'm not interested in going on about After Strange Gods, which I suspect some of you thought of. And the subject of Eliot's anti-Semitism it's not interesting to me. The indictments of Eliot's indubitable anti-Semitism and the defenses of him both are not of interest to me. What I am interested in is the set of social ambitions, despairs, and attitudes in which that phenomenon takes place for Eliot, for Ginsberg, and for you and me. At some point in a history class, when I was at Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, I was very struck by the idea that the United States is a great country, a great nation, our military power, our economic power, the power of our culture, our music, our film, indeed of our poetry embodied by Walt Whitman. All of that is great. We are a great nation, a great people, but the idea I absorbed said, we are not yet a great people. We are still in the process of becoming a people, and that is not necessarily a despairing or unpatriotic idea. It means we are still engaged in this exciting process of being a people, and the great racial divide is only the most egregious, the most notable fragmentation in that category. I'm going to cite for you a peculiar book called The Ordeal of Civility. There it is in mirror. I can't hold the book up. You will read it backwards. It's by John Murray Cudahy. The subtitle is Freud, Marx, Levi-Strauss, and the Jewish Struggle with Modernity. The thesis of Cudahy's book, I'll try a brutal quick summary, is that the Jews who came west to Western Europe from the east, the Ostjuden, very rapidly entered the society, they entered the culture, and it was painful and unnatural and difficult for them to enter civil life, social life. And this awkwardness in success, his thesis is, enabled a generation in Europe to overcome euphemisms. Charcot and others had pointed out the sexual nature of family life and psychology. Freud said it directly, rudely in this context. Similarly about the nature of economic relations and Marx, that as part of a Jewish tradition of entering a culture, Freud, Marx, and Levi-Strauss isolated realities that others hesitated to recognize. I'll read a couple of sentences from Cudahy. Thus, Jewish emancipation, assimilation, and modernization constitute a single total phenomenon. The secularizing Jewish intellectual, as the avant-garde of his decolonized people, suffered in his own person the trauma of this culture shock, unable to turn back, unable completely to acculturate, caught between his own, whom he had left behind, and the Gentile host culture, where he felt at ease, ill at ease, and alienated. It is tailor-made for a recently decolonized new nation, indigenous to the West, whose now dispersed nationals, end quote, have had neither time nor opportunity to internalize that system of informal restraints we are calling the Protestant etiquette. Protestant interiority and internalization is the triple form of an ethic, an aesthetic, and an etiquette, was the functional modernizing equivalent of what for Catholic and Jews in the Middle Ages had been formalized. Jewry was in the 19th century exiting from its Middle Ages. I'm going to propose tentatively and hoping that those with scholarship better than mine may find a better way for me to put this. What that suggests to me is that Cudahy's analysis of the Jews of the generation of Freud or the generation of Marx in Europe were experiencing the culture very much in the way that T.S. Eliot, the inheritor of a post-Emersonian, his grandfather was an Emersonian, that Eliot's feeling, Eliot as an upper class, a member of the post-Emersonian or Emersonian American upper class, experienced something extremely similar to what Cudahy describes in Europe, so that Eliot in some ways identified with, associated his own displacement with the same as what Cudahy describes in the Jews who are entering the culture and the nation, but not the social life. In the Paris Review interview, Eliot says he's aware that his writing is much more like that of his American contemporaries than that of any of the English people writing in his generation. And in this context, I think that what he says in the essay on the function of poetry is just extraordinary. In the function of poetry, he says that poetry makes a difference to a society as a whole, and that means to people who do not enjoy poetry. I include even those who do not know the names of their own national poets. That is the real subject of this paper. It's quite remarkable. The real subject of this paper, The Function of Poetry, is basically that it has a social and cultural patriotic function. He goes on, we observe that poetry differs from every other art in having a value for the people of the poet's race and language, which it can have for no other. It is true that even music and painting have a local and racial character, but certainly the difficulties of appreciation in these arts for a foreigner are much less. Poetry is much more local and prose can be seen in the history of European languages. Skipping a bit, emotion and feeling then are best expressed in the common language of the people, that is, in the language common to all classes. The structure, the rhythm, the sound, the idiom of a language express the personality of the people, singular, the people which speaks it, which I believe I, for decades now, have associated that with the idea that we are still, excitingly, I'll say it again in a positive way, we are still becoming a people. It is an ongoing project. We're not a people in the sense that we imagine, I don't know enough to be certain of this, that the Japanese are a people, or the Welsh or the Scottish are a people. We are still creating that, which to me means it's a quite exciting project for the reasons Eliot says, for poets in particular. As he says, as Eliot says, in tradition and the individual talent, you don't inherit it. The tradition is something you work to create. And on the one hand, in the function of poetry, in a sense, you do inherit it. Even if you don't like poetry, it's part of the heritage of a people. And on the other hand, in tradition and the individual talent, something much more that you work at. I associate that working at it with those 1958 dreams that Allen Ginsberg had. He dreamed that at a party, Eliot said, I very much want to read your work. He had a dream in which T.S. Eliot tucks him into bed. And one says, why is it? Why is it that Eliot records those dreams in his journals? Why was Eliot so important to him? And Ginsberg, like Eliot, an extremely unhappy child, young man, he worked very, very hard at the job that Eliot describes of working hard to attain and acquire and enter the tradition. I'll read a little bit from each poet, but I won't read from the journals. They're very brief. I've told you about the journals. He dreams that Eliot liked his poet. Then he becomes ashamed of it. Then he becomes ashamed of being ashamed of it. He's clearly quite contorted in his feelings about Eliot. And in that same year, he assigned himself and did an exercise in iambic pentameter in blank verse that was not Miltonic, but idiomatic, closer to Wordsworth or to Eliot than to Milton. I cannot Can I have been mistaken and God mad, or lost my path to beauty in such way that now I cannot separate strands of gold from strands of wool, or haircloth punishment from my own robe? My flesh is torn and bald, my aches, my body, but my brain is reeled and know not what I am or meant to be, nor know the future that I thought would be the shining, livid action of eternity to rescue me, the broken phonograph record of the soul, the faded photograph destroyed by too much light the brain conceived and unconceived. That exercise it's quite long, he reprints it, it is reprinted in his journals. He titles it Hypnagogic Automatic Writing Shakespeare Junk. And the line I can never resist quoting from Hypnagogic Automatic Writing Shakespeare Junk is when in iambic pentameter, he writes an extremely scannable line, "Let cockcrow crown the buttocks of my Pete." A little erotic idealization of his lifelong lover and boyfriend, Peter Orlovsky. "Let cockcrow crown the buttocks of my Pete." I think what I intuited and continue to feel and hear in these two poets is that relation to culture that is universalizing, alienated, desperate, and aspirationally assimilative. If proof rock is an uncertain, awkward, sexually and socially diffident, very young person adopting the mask of an older, middle-aged person, that is the rhetoric of proof rock. The young, uncertain, diffident person dons the mask of a weary, aging person. In that poem, and even more in The Wasteland, the writer who feels what Cudahy describes, an inability to enter the actual social life of a culture with any confidence. The mask is, it's not quite Cambridge, Massachusetts in the 20s or 30s. It's not London. Where is it? Where are those oyster bars with sawdust? They existed in New York and Boston, I know. Maybe they existed in London and Liverpool as well. But like the constructed person of proof rock, in Eliot's poetry, there's a convincing but simulated, polyglot, syncretic cultural setting. I'll read the passages to you that I find similar. I'm hoping that I'm going to profit by questions and remarks, and that as scholars, you will be able to guide me in this. There's along with Cudahy, there's a book by someone named Samuel Fleischacker called The Ethics of Culture that is behind what I'm trying to say to you. Fleischacker is very interesting on the subject of cultural relativism, which we find in Eliot and I believe in Ginsberg in similar ways. And he very interestingly quotes Herder. Herder has a scene in which the Asian and Indian asks the Westerner, are you ready to admit that your religion has been oppressive, extortive, that you've colonized and killed and violated? And the Christian says, well, that is quite over now. I'm going to baptize you so you can go to heaven. And with his dying words, the Indian says, I don't want to go to heaven if there are going to be white people there. And in Fleischacker's opinion, that's Herder as an Enlightenment person advancing that assimilative, syncretic, relativistic interest in putting a lot of cultures together to solve what could be described as a personal social dilemma. What order shall I do this in? I guess I'll start with the familiar. What are the roots that clutch? What branches grow? That's very much like sunbeam crowned the cockroach of my peat. What are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of this stony rubbish? Son of man, you cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images where the sun beats and the dead tree gives no shelter, the cricket no relief, and the dry stone no sound of water, only there is shadow under this red rock. Come in under the shadow of this red rock, and I will show you something different from either your shadow at morning striding behind you or your shadow at evening rising to meet you. I will show you fear and a handful of dust. Frisch weht der Wind, der Heimat zu mein irisch Kind. Wo fallest du? You gave me the hyacinths. You gave me hyacinths first a year ago. They called me the hyacinth girl. Yet when we came back late from the hyacinth garden, your arms full and your hair wet, I could not speak. My eyes failed. I was neither living nor dead, and I knew nothing, looking into the heart of light, the silence. Oed und leer das Meer. Madame Sosostris, famous clairvoyante, had a bad cold, nevertheless is known to be the wisest woman in Europe, with a wicked pack of cards. Here, said she, is your card, the drowned Phoenician sailor. Those are pearls, were his eyes. Look, here is Belladonna and the Lady of the Rocks, the Lady of Situations. Here is the man with 3 staves, and here the wheel, and here is the one-eyed merchant. And this card, which is blank, is something he carries on his back, which I am forbidden to see. And for me, that passage is related to the ordeal of civility, finding a social realm one enters as a member, as belonging to, and having instead fragments. I'll read to you, and this is going back to when I was very young, finding these poets quite similar. Up all night, talking, reading the Kaddish aloud, listening to Ray Charles blues about blind on the phonograph, the rhythm, your memory in my head 3 years after. and read Adonaius's last triumphant stanzas aloud, wept, realizing how we suffer and how death is that remedy all singers dream of. Sing, remember, prophecy, as in the Hebrew anthem or the Buddhist Book of Answers, in my own imagination of a withered leaf at dawn, dreaming back through life, your time and mine, accelerating toward apocalypse, the final moment, the flower burning in the day, and what comes after, looking back on the mind itself that saw an American city a flash away, and the great dream of me or China or you and a phantom Russia, or a crumpled bed that never existed, like a poem in the dark, escaped back to oblivion, no more to say, and nothing to weep for but the beings in the dream, trapped in its disappearance, sighing, screaming with it, buying and selling pieces of phantom, worshiping each other, worshiping the God included in it all, longing or inevitability while it lasts, a vision. Anything more? Toward the key in the window, and the great key lays its head of light on top of Manhattan and over the floor, and lays down on the sidewalk in a single vast beam, moving as I walk down first toward the Yiddish theater and the place of poverty you knew. The tarot, Adonais, the music. In both cases, I hear something aggressively fragmentary. And though in a way, the relativism and the interest in many different cultures could be looked as being part of the Enlightenment, could go back to the word idea post-Emersonian. There's also, on the other hand, a feeling that only the unconscious incantatory quality of poetry can begin to hold these together into a social reality of the kind that he envisions when he talks about the function of poetry, where he says the function of poetry is to supply a people with a reality that the people has as a shared good. And in both, it's incantational and eclectic, hopefully syncretic, rather than nationalistic or firm in those ways. I'll avoid apology now. I'll avoid apology, but incorporate it by mentioning it and saying that, as Jamie and I put in the description, I'm going to relate this to 2016 and indeed the present by closing with two of my poems that to me are deeply related to that culturally polyglot stream in Kadesh, in the wasteland, in that passage from Herder that Fleischacker cites. And the ordeal of civility and the pressure to become a people, more or less consciously in my mind, in the two poems I'm going to read you. This poem, the first one, is from my book, At the Foundling Hospital, Mixed Chorus. And the word foundling is probably relevant. I find the figure of the foundling much more interesting and germane to my interests than the figure of the orphan. The orphan feels disconnected from parents. That's not my experience of culture or the experience I read in the artists I admire. The passage from the wasteland and the passage from Kadesh, for me, are related to the situation of the foundling. Here I am. I'm being given a language, a name, a context. I didn't create it. I am willy-nilly plunged into it. It may help for the poem Mixed Chorus if I mention the poem. I incorporate some phrases from the essayist W.E.B. Du Bois, and I incorporate some writing from an ode by the Roman poet Horace. Horace's father was a slave. Not that the word slave meant the same thing in the empire as it meant in the founding of the planter culture in the United States, but still Horace's father was a slave. Mixed chorus. My real name is Israel Bailin. My father was a Roman slave who gained his freedom. I was first named Ralph Waldo Ellison, but I changed it to the name of one of your cities because I was born a Jew in Belarusia. I sit with Shakespeare, and he winces not. My other name is Flaccus. I wrote an essay on the theme, You Choose Your Ancestors. It won't be any feeble, conventional wings I'll rise on, not I, born of poor parents. Look, my ankles are changed already. New white feathers are sprouting on my shoulders. These are my wings. Across the color line, I summon Aurelius and Aristotle. Threading through Philistine and Amalekite, they come, all graciously and without condescension. I took the name Irving or Caesar or Creole Jack. Someday they'll study me in Hungary, Newark, and LA. So spare me your needless tribute. Spare me the red hideousness of Georgia. I wrote your white Christmas for you. And my third name, Burghardt, is Dutch. For all you know, I am related to Spinoza, Walcott, Pissarro. And in fact, my grandfather Burghart's first name was Othello. And I still surprise myself every time I'm reminded that W.E.B. Du Bois's grandfather, Burghardt, Dutch name, his name was Othello Burghardt. And Israel Bailin is the birth name of Irving Berlin, who did write White Christmas. He also wrote Easter Parade while he was at it. And that line, I sit with Shakespeare and he winces not, it's an iambic pentameter that appears exactly that way in Du Bois's essay on the souls of Black folk. And I can't tell you how consciously or deliberately I was thinking about Ginsberg or Eliot or the ordeal of civility in that poem. But as a reader, when I look at it, I certainly identify those threads. And I certainly think about the project of imagining a people whose accomplishments include a tradition that goes back to Horace, possibly the greatest model for poetry there is, certainly unsurpassed model, and that includes as well Irving Berlin writing White Christmas. So I'll close with one more poem. Like Mixed Chorus, this is a recent poem, maybe a couple of years old. I published it in a magazine a couple of years ago. Like that poem, I'm very interested in names and the place of culture in names. As I would say about Eliot, Eliot is part of a cultural consciousness that in our country is probably most recognizable in the Jewish relation to culture. And for Eliot, it's more like that American relation than the European one Cudahy was writing about. And it very much has to do with names. Robert Lowell writes about he and Eliot talking about their names. And don't you hate your grandfather who was president of Harvard? Oh, yes, I do. I do mine too. Something like that. And that is in the kind, my poem is called, I'll close with this, and I welcome and invite questions. My poem is called Poem of Names. The chains of begets and birth, the chains of names are meaning itself, the chains of deaths and doings. The black rain fell on Osamu Shimomura. On the walk home, it turned his white shirt black. Quote, my grandmother got me quickly into a bath. It likely saved me from death by radiation. End quote. Tuvalu's Ernst Borinsky would not discuss his family killed by Nazis. Quote, an area I have liquidated for my mental health, end quote. His grave at Tuvalu, a kind of shrine. Salma begat Boaz, and Boaz begat Obed, underground river of passion and retrenchment. Thank you, Eliot, Simon, and Hazel, for wanting to talk with me about my dying someday. Catfish had been so cold when you touched his body. A compliment for me, that conversation. It almost doesn't matter what we said. I thought of Milford, your great-grandpa, that time I asked him, did he believe in life after death? I guess that you are my life after death, he said. A boy named Christian at a Q&A in Texas asked me, the visiting poet, what motivates you? What gets you out of bed each day? Good question. Willie Lee Rose, historian of Reconstruction. Micheline Dumont-Oujou, Belgian resistance. The Nazis killed her family as well. She ran an underground that saved American pilots. Congressman Peter Rodino, called Pete. It's the dead people, the one whose names I need to tell you, Christian. That's what motivates me. Emily Dickinson, William Butler Yeats, the shame of Nathan Forrest, of Pillow Hill, the pride of Ernst Borinsky, of Mississippi, Joyce Ladner, his student. Christian, look it up. As to your name, I remember Don Polk saying, a lot of Jewish people think they're white, but no, they're not. In some ways, Yeats was a jerk. Arphaxad begat Salah, Salah begat Eber. Oh yeah, said Ruby to Don. Well, most Black people don't know they're Goyim. Somebody said about Rodino and Sarika, the night school guys are saving the country. Borinsky needed a job, but no white school could offer him a position. Tuvalu did. At his famous forums there, he asked his students to sit one chair apart so the white kids from Millsaps sat among them. Pete Seeger, Ralph Bunch, Joan Baez at the forums. Rodino in the House, impeaching Nixon. Pellegrino means pilgrim. Shimomura discovered cells that made a jellyfish glow. He garnered 1 million samples in Puget Sound. A protein in Aquaria victoria, embedded to glimmer in other life, transformed the study of living things. Years later, the Exxon Valdez oil spill left nearly all of those Aquaria dead, a poisoning that Shimomura indicted. He, whose grandma had washed away the ashes.
Thank you, Robert, for that very elegant and associative meditation about culture and poetry and the arts. As a reminder to the assembled, if you have a question, send me a message in the chat so that we can highlight you and then put you up on the screen. Our first question for you, Robert, is from your colleague in your department at BU, Anita Patterson.
Oh, great. I thought there was going to be a long line. Hi, Robert. I'm not that far away from you. I'm just a few blocks away from you. It's a beautiful day.
Yes.
And I know this is part of our ongoing conversation. But David Chinitz in a previous panel said, "Who is we?" And he said this because he's worried. He's worried about the future of Eliot's readability, the future of Eliot's studies. In other words, there's such change over time in student readership, in the question of who is America,
Yes.
that he sees it as a threat. And yet, what you're suggesting, I think, and tell me if I'm right, is that this question is central to our kind of polyglot, syncretic culture.
Absolutely.
And that indeed, it's something that the poet needs to ask in order to engage tradition.
Yes.
And the reason I'm suggesting this is it's a much more optimistic view of thinking about Eliot's legacy. I teach your book in my classes, and including the poem Mixed Chorus, which I think it's illuminating to students to understand your engagement with Ellison, with modernism, and with Eliot.
Yeah.
And Du Bois. This idea that poetry, in a way, needs this sort of fragmentation, and that so anyway, I just thank you for being hopeful.
It's our job. I think it's our job as teachers, as scholars, as writers. It's our job to give the young their entitlement to that tradition. I think when I was 17, when I was a freshman in college, I liked having the best. I didn't care that Shakespeare was kind of anti-Semitic, or Yeats, like an old Jew man in Yeats. Fortunately for me, in my opinion, I was interested, like it or not, Ezra Pound, you're my Ezra Pound now. As to your admiration for Mussolini, fuck you, and thank you for your work. It now belongs to me. And it's our job to present that to our students as a particularly urgently American undertaking. The Fleischacker book, it's very much a scholar's book. I haven't read enough things to really appreciate it. It's a somewhat, pardon the expression, dry experience for me. But he shows how the appreciation, his main thesis is that culture, every culture, contains ethics. And that's the way you get ethics. I almost incorporated into this talk a wonderful passage in Einstein, where Einstein in his journal says, there's too much education. People don't learn things from school. They learn things from doing things. Mm-hmm. And he makes that an ethical principle. So you don't need a lecture saying the Holocaust was very bad, slavery was bad too. You need to experience a cultural proportion. You need, and it's our job, and I think there's a scholarly part of the job. And you're not to be too mutually admiring, though I guess we are. You're writing about the connection between American Black poets like Langston Hughes and Sterling Brown, Gwendolyn Brooks, and their international colleagues, particularly Spanish speaking, but not only, is an important part of American culture. It's related in my mind to that essay of Ralph Ellison's, in which he says, you choose your ancestors. Mm-hmm. He says, I choose Hemingway as my ancestor. Faulkner's my ancestor, says Ellison. And Ezra Pound was an awful person, but he said a lot of things about poetry that are very important to me. So I can be ashamed of my ancestor. I don't have to approve of everything my ancestor did and said, but at least he wasn't president of Harvard.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Our next question is from Bob von Hallberg. Bob?
Hi there, Robert. Good to see you. Thank you for the talk. I'm still turning it over, and I wanted to take you back to the Eliot essay that you brought to life when showing your astonishment at what Eliot said about the impact of poetry on people who don't read poems. Yes. And that has this background that I'm sure you're familiar with in both Eliot and Pound, about this notion of cleaning the language, that is purifying the dialect of the tribe. Pound made the case that we're going to get good litigation if we have clarity of terms. And so I have a comment, but my question is, do you think that is the conduit from poetry to its consequences, that is to say, influence on the language?
Emphatically, no. I find that formulation of Pound's one of the most offensive thing about my ancestor, Ezra Pound. I dislike purify, and I dislike tribe. To purify, I've read the language, if it is the dialect of the tribe. That to me is fascistic and let's say racialist rather than racist. To talk about the tribes are created by blood for the most part. And purity is not the genius of American art to me. Mixing, heteroglossia, so that for me, it's just what's wrong with Pound is to purify the language of the tribe. We're not a tribe, we're a people. And we don't need purity, we need to appreciate variety and mixing and the vigor of inventions and hybrids. Thus, I try to put Horace and W.E.B. Du Bois and Irving Berlin, and I forget who else, into one first-person plural. I was fascinated, again, going back to college, that the chorus in the Greek drama, the chorus speaks, they're chanting, apparently echoing what a military practice. You're shoulder to shoulder with spears and shields. And the chorus in the tragedy is reproducing that chanting, so that you're like a human tank. Even if you're mortally wounded, you're keeping the rhythm. And they chant in the dramas in the first person singular, I. They speak in the singular, and that is Euripides or Sophocles, whoever is writing the chorus, trying to imagine that speech, which for me is very different than purifying. For me, that's an aspect of Pound that I don't like.
May I follow up?
Please.
Point taken about the term purity. May I ask you to conjecture a little bit on the term correction? Because I was going to make the point that when you speak with obvious care. You make people wait for the word. You have patience in choosing your word. Ditto with your writing. This is all to your credit. And in your recent books in your recent poems where you speak about the etymology of the word thing, and pliers, and so forth. This I would call correction. Don't need the term purify and point taken there, but there is a function in your work and in your work today, in your speaking at your own pace, and with the sense of terms not just taken up in order to keep the flow going, but moving slowly, correctly, and I would say memorably. And that I think is what appeals to me about the Eliot and Pound notion of correction of language, correction of usage. What do you have thoughts about that?
I do. I'm looking for my Einstein. Here is ideas and opinions. I would say rather than corrections, you set a model of excellence. When I heard my teacher, Paul Fussell, I didn't know he'd been terribly wounded in the war. When I heard him speak, I saw a model of excellence. Einstein says, the most important method of education, accordingly, always has consisted of that in which the pupil was urged to actual performance. This applies as well to the first attempts at writing of the primary boy as to the doctor's thesis on graduation from the university, as to the mere memorizing of a poem. Should one perhaps try to realize this aim by moralizing? Not at all. Words are and remain an empty sound. The road to perdition has ever been accompanied by lip service to an ideal. Personalities are formed not by what is heard and said, but by labor and activity. And correction to me is not what he's saying. Correction is like moralizing. You must seek and strive to present models of excellence in language or in anything else. And for me, that's a distinction. I am finishing an autobiography, and I talk about a regret I felt after reading. This is not what you were saying, Bob, but someone in the audience said, the poetry was so musical, it sounded very good, and you pronounced the consonants very distinctly, and that's impressive. But for me, that's not like American culture. American speech is rather slurred. I don't remember what I said. I know it was not very good. I let the team down. In the autobiography, I say, I wish I had just said, Nat Cole, Frank Sinatra, Gene Autry. The great American popular singers enunciate very carefully. On YouTube, you can see Little Richard, as he was called, Pennyworth, sing "Send Me Some Loving." He hits every consonant very precisely. And as I say, I think I let the team down. This is related in my mind to the interesting, very ambivalent, complicated correspondence between Groucho and T.S. Eliot, and that dinner party, and a mixture of mutual interest and esteem and negativity. And it's a cultural process that I recognize and feel patriotic about.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bob.
Robert, before we go on to our next question, just a clarification. One of the references that you've talked about and that we'll put in the chat for folks who are asking about it is Samuel Fleischacker, The Ethics of Culture. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, Ria has just put that in the chat function.
Yes, there's this other book. It's at 1994 Cornell University. I'll mention, I'm pretending to be a scholar. I'll mention one other book. I'll be right back.
And while we're waiting for Robert to rummage through his books, we'll highlight Wei Zhu, who is our next questioner. So just hang on a minute, Wei, until he comes back.
I may not find it. The title, I don't like the title, but I do like a lot in the book. I can't almost remember his name. The title is Post-Ethnic America.
That's it. We'll search for it while you answer Wei Zhu, and then we'll put it in the chat.
Okay, good. Wei Zhu, I'm listening.
Yeah, thanks for your lecture. It was really fascinating. I'm very interested by the association you made between Allen Ginsberg and T.S. Eliot. Like, I really liked Ginsberg when I was a teenager, so it was great to get your insight. Well, so I'm kind of interested by the example you gave. One of the examples you share with us. So you talk about Prufrock as one example between these two poets. I mean, his sexual awkwardness and his kind of inability to be assimilated into the society. So I'm wondering, what's your perspective on sexuality in terms of both Ginsberg and T.S. Eliot in your talk, especially of course, Ginsberg he celebrates his queer sexuality. He's a gay poet, whereas T.S. Eliot has a lot of ambiguity in his poems about his sexual orientation. Is there a possibility that Ginsberg kind of sensed this kind of resonance in T.S. Eliot, so he really feel associated with? And what's that to do with cultural assimilation? Broadly.
I think you're exactly right that Ginsberg, I'll give a spectrum in time. Ginsberg is in the middle between the very unhappy gay young man. His father, Louis's friend, William Carlos Williams, wrote a preface to Howl and Other Poems. And William says, I never expected this boy to live a full life. I didn't think he would make it. He was so unhappy. And there's that Ginsberg, and then there's the Ginsberg writing in the 70s and 80s, basically gay pornography, just writing long poems that give as much detailed graphic description of homosexual sex as he can devise. And the 1958 T.S. Eliot fantasies, I'll speculate that Ginsberg, you can almost hear it. I hear Ginsberg delighted by the comedy of his dreaming about Eliot, that the dream is at least a bit sexual, being tucked into bed, and that it's outrageous, and he appreciates the outrageousness, and is a little afraid by it. He's in the middle. He's not yet at that later one. It's worth reading just a sentence or two from Williams with what you're talking about. This is in the process. The first sentences of Williams's preface. When he was younger and I was younger, I used to know Allen Ginsberg, a young poet living in Paterson, New Jersey, son of a well-known poet. He was physically slight of build and mentally much disturbed by the life he had encountered about him during those first years after the First World War. He was always on the point of, quote, going away when it didn't seem to matter. He disturbed me. I never thought he'd live to grow up and write a book of poems. His ability to survive, travel, and go on writing astonishes me. That he's gone on developing and perfecting his art is no less amazing to me. So that all of the personal and social dilemmas, including his sexuality, his probably formed very early sexual preference for men, that seemed to be full of doom. And the diaries with the Eliot dreams and that iambic pentameter exercise are halfway along a rather extraordinary journey or progress.
That's amazing.
Thanks.
Our next question is from Larry Melton.
First of all, thank you for not always being able to find something in the midst of your careful organization. That's my world.
I finally came up with Einstein.
I did appreciate that. I live in a much less scholarly world of ragtime jazz and Tin Pan Alley.
Larry, I have to object to your less scholarly than thou attitude.
Well, I was reveling in it until you said that. Now I'll take it back. I have been intrigued by the fact that the most American popular culture has come from the Jewish Central American immigrant, the Black former slave, the Hispanic American, and your reference to those elements earlier resonated so much with me, because in a time of what I see as awful divisiveness, I am reminded that the American is all of those elements and not the so-called American that is often defined in our, at least in our political culture. Yeah. I'm drawn to your work again. I haven't experienced it for some time now, but I do so appreciate your comments about American popular culture and its unscholarly element, if you will. We have a beautiful heritage. Literature.
Yes. My suggestion is that it applies to Eliot as well. That Eliot too needed to find a way to participate, and it's become a kind of truism.
Yes.
We're in the stress of the truism now, that in some ways the white Protestant feels more excluded and more out of it and more of a minority than ever and than anyone. And it's a lot of our worst things and a lot of our best things come precisely from impurity. And I'll quote one of my colleagues. I didn't make this up, that my colleague was throwing doubt on the concept of cultural appropriation as something bad. And he said, probably the most successful example I can think of cultural appropriation is Africans enslaved in the United States appropriating Christianity and making a good thing out of it. making it something that helped them hold together, helped them find a way, helped them to fit in, was useful culturally in many, many ways. And I'm pleased to find it going back in that Fleischacker book, going back to Herder, going back to the very roots of the Enlightenment.
Sweetly. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. And I'm less scholarly than you. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
We'll take one more question. This one's from Tony Kuda.
Thanks, Jamie. Thank you so much, Robert. I was thinking while you were talking and kind of lining up some of the names that you were going through, tracing back to Emerson and Whitman, and then forward to Ginsberg, and it felt like you were kind of recreating or rehearsing the American bardic tradition. That is the kind of poet, the tradition that embraces this very kind of constructive and all-encompassing a vision of culture, and one that can come together in a poet figure as a spokesman. Is that anywhere near the point? Would you put Eliot in that tradition? And if so, do we look at The Wasteland then as a song of myself instead of a kind of Jeremiad?
I'll answer by saying something I wish I knew more about. I wish I knew more about Eliot's reactionary reaction to his family as a founding family by his generation of the Unitarian Church in St. Louis. And I think of the Unitarian Church as very much Emersonian, and that my graduate school teacher, Ivor Winters, said that the New England, the Emersonians, they had the habits of their Puritan ancestors. And as the literal beliefs and the doctrines of the Puritan ancestors gradually fell away through the generations, they still had the habits. They were quite ethical people, but without the intellectual Calvinist scaffolding, they soon went crazy and degenerated. And I am not making an assertion, I'm making a question of how much did a vision like that characterize Eliot's reluctance to stay within that Emersonian tradition, but on the contrary, to go back to I guess it's the Anglican Church Fathers and to the sermons of Lancelot Andrews and John Donne and his reactionary, literally, relation to the Whitmanian or Emersonian tradition.
I like that you've kind of dragged him kicking and screaming back into that tradition where it seems like he really belongs. So I thank you for that. And I think your point is entirely right, that he resisted it very strongly, but
that's what he was looking for. Yeah. And we got wonderful poems. The conflicts in four quartets would not be there without that profound ambivalence.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert Pinsky. It's been a great pleasure to be with you. Thanks for your lecture and for your very engaging questions.
Thank you, Jimmy. Thank you all.
We'll be back at 3 o'clock, folks.